My mother-in-law called the police on me for child abuse, and I'm forever grateful she did. I was loading my 3-year-old daughter Emma into her car seat when the police cruiser pulled into my driveway with lights flashing. My mother-in-law Diane stood on her front porch across the street with her phone still in her hand, and an expression I'd never seen before. Officer Marcus Yates stepped out of his vehicle and asked if I was Jonathan Crawford. I said yes, while my daughter started crying because the sirens had scared her. He told me to step away from the vehicle, and I asked what this was about. Diane had called 911 reporting suspected child abuse at this address. I looked at my mother-in-law standing there with her arms crossed and felt my face get hot. I told the officer there was no abuse happening and this was a misunderstanding. He said he still needed to examine my daughter and asked me to unbuckle her from the car seat. I reached in to get Emma, but she was screaming now, and the officer put his hand on my shoulder telling me to let him do it. He lifted Emma out carefully while she cried for me and started checking her arms and legs for bruises. My hands were shaking with rage as I watched Diane walk across the street toward us. She told the officer she'd seen suspicious marks on Emma's body during bath time yesterday when she was babysitting. That I'd been acting strange and defensive when she'd asked about them. That my wife Kelly had been working late every night and I was alone with Emma too much. The officer found several dark bruises on Emma's upper arms and asked how they got there. I explained that Emma had been learning to ride her new tricycle and kept falling off it, that the bruises were from her grabbing the handlebars wrong and hitting the ground. Diane interrupted, saying the bruises looked like finger marks from someone grabbing too hard. The officer's expression changed and he asked if he could take Emma inside to examine her more thoroughly. I unlocked the front door and we all went into the living room where toys were scattered across the floor. The officer had Emma sit on the couch while he checked her more carefully. He found bruises on both upper arms that did look like someone had grabbed her. He asked Emma in a gentle voice how she got the ouchies on her arms. She said, "Daddy's friend hurt her and my stomach dropped through the floor." I asked what friend and Emma said, "The man who comes over when mommy's at work." I had no idea what she was talking about and told the officer I didn't have any friends who came over. Diane's face showed something between vindication and horror. The officer asked Emma to describe the man and she said he was tall with dark hair and he'd grabbed her arms when she wouldn't stop crying. I felt the room spinning because this didn't make any sense. I was with Emma every evening while Kelly worked late at the hospital. Nobody else came over. Officer Yates asked if my wife was home and I said she was working a double shift and wouldn't be back until tomorrow morning. He said he needed to call Child Protective Services and I needed to explain who had access to my daughter. I pulled out my phone to call Kelly, but the officer told me to wait. Another patrol car arrived and a female officer named Denise Holloway came inside. She took Emma into the kitchen to ask her more questions privately while Officer Yates sat me down on the couch. He asked me to walk him through a typical evening routine, and I explained that Kelly worked 12-hour shifts at County General 3 to 4 days a week. That I was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home. That Emma and I spent evenings together eating dinner, playing, and doing bath time before bed. He asked if anyone else had keys to the house, and I said, just Kelly and Diane. My mother-in-law had a spare key for emergencies, and sometimes watched Emma when both Kelly and I had work conflicts. Officer Holloway came back into the living room with Emma and asked to speak with Officer Yates privately. They went outside while Diane sat in the armchair staring at me. I asked her why she'd called the police instead of just talking to me first. She said she'd noticed the bruises yesterday and asked Emma about them. That Emma had said something about a man hurting her and Diane had been worried sick all night. That she'd tried calling me this morning but I didn't answer because I'd been in the shower. She'd seen me loading Emma into the car and thought I might be trying to leave town. I told her that was insane. We were just going to the park. She asked why I wasn't more concerned about Emma saying a man hurt her. I said I was extremely concerned, but there was no man coming to our house. The officers came back inside and Officer Yates said they needed me to come to the station to give a formal statement. That Emma would be taken to the hospital for a full examination and placed in temporary protective custody until this was sorted out. I started arguing that they couldn't take my daughter and Officer Holloway said they absolutely could based on Emma's statement and the physical evidence. Diane offered to go to the hospital with Emma and the officers agreed. I watched them load my crying daughter into the patrol car while I stood in my driveway feeling completely helpless. Officer Yates drove me to the police station in silence. At the station, they put me in an interview room with a camera in the corner and told me to wait. I sat there for 45 minutes before a detective named Laura Pierce came in with a file folder. She said they'd reviewed the initial report and needed me to explain several things. She asked about my relationship with my daughter, and I said it was great. We were very close. She was my whole world. She asked about my marriage, and I said it was solid despite Kelly's long work hours. She asked if I'd ever lost my temper with Emma, and I admitted I'd raised my voice a few times when she wouldn't listen, but never hurt her. Detective Pierce pulled out photos from the folder showing Emma's bruises in detail. She said the pattern was consistent with someone gripping a small child's arms with adult-sized hands. That Emma had told them a man grabbed her when she was crying too much. I explained again that nobody came to our house and those bruises were from falling off her tricycle. Detective Pierce asked if Kelly had any male friends who might visit while I was out. I said Kelly barely had time for anything outside of work and definitely didn't have friends coming over to our house. She asked about my own friends, and I admitted I didn't have many since moving to this city 2 years ago for Kelly's job. She asked about my relationship with Diane, and I said it was complicated. That my mother-in-law had never fully approved of me marrying her daughter. That she thought Kelly had married down by choosing a freelance designer instead of another doctor. Detective Pierce made notes and said they were pulling my phone records and would be searching my house. I asked if I needed a lawyer, and she said that was my right, but innocent people usually didn't lawyer up immediately. I said I wanted to cooperate fully because I had nothing to hide. She left the room, and I sat there for another hour. My phone buzzed with texts from Kelly asking what was happening. Diane had called her at the hospital, and she was trying to get someone to cover her shift. I texted back explaining the situation, and she called immediately. Kelly was crying and asking how this could be happening. I said I had no idea, but Emma had told the police a man hurt her, and I didn't know what man she was talking about. Kelly went silent on the other end. I asked if she knew something, and she said no, but her voice sounded strange. Detective Pierce came back and said they'd gotten permission to search the house, and forensics was there now. She asked about security cameras, and I said we had a Ring doorbell camera that recorded the front entrance. She asked for access to the footage, and I gave her my login information. She left again, and I sat there watching the clock on the wall. At some point, Officer Yates brought me water and a sandwich from the vending machine. He said Emma was at the hospital being examined, and so far hadn't said anything else about the man who hurt her. I asked if I could see her, and he said not until they cleared me of suspicion. Kelly burst through the station doors around 3 p.m., still wearing her scrubs. She demanded to see me, and Detective Pierce brought her into the interview room. Kelly hugged me and asked if I'd really hurt Emma. I pulled back and asked how she could even ask that. She said she didn't know what to believe because Emma wouldn't lie about a man grabbing her. I told Kelly there was no man, and I needed her to believe me. She asked if maybe Emma had gotten confused or mixed up a dream with reality. I said maybe, but the bruises were real, and I couldn't explain them. Kelly sat down heavily in the chair and put her face in her hands. She said Diane had been calling her for months, saying she was worried about me, that I seemed stressed and short-tempered with Emma, that Kelly was working too much, and I was overwhelmed being the primary caregiver. Kelly admitted she'd been brushing it off as Diane being overprotective and judgmental. Now she didn't know what to think. I felt betrayed that Kelly had been discussing me with her mother behind my back. That they'd been building a narrative about me being a bad father while I'd been doing everything to keep our family running. Kelly started crying and saying she just wanted Emma to be safe. That if I'd done something, we needed to figure it out and get help. I stood up and told Kelly I hadn't done anything and couldn't believe she was doubting me. Detective Pierce came back in and asked Kelly to come with her. They left me alone again, and I could hear their voices in the hallway, but couldn't make out words. An hour later, Detective Pierce returned with a laptop and said they'd reviewed the Ring doorbell footage from the past 2 weeks. She pulled up several clips showing me and Emma leaving and entering the house. Nothing suspicious. But then she showed me a clip from 3 nights ago at 8:45 p.m. The video showed a man approaching our front door and using a key to let himself in. He stayed inside for 2 hours and left at 10:52 p.m. The timestamp showed this was while Kelly was at work, and I should have been home with Emma. I stared at the screen trying to process what I was seeing. The man was in his 30s with dark hair, wearing jeans and a jacket. I didn't recognize him at all. I asked where I was during this, and Detective Pierce said that was her question. I pulled out my phone and checked my calendar for that night. I'd had a virtual meeting with a client that ran from 8 to 10 p.m. I'd been in my home office on a video call the entire time. I told Detective Pierce this, and she asked if Emma had been with me. I said no, she'd been in her room. We had a baby monitor, but I'd muted it during the client call so the audio wouldn't interfere. My heart was pounding as I realized what must have happened. Someone had been in my house while I was working, and I'd had no idea. Detective Pierce asked who had keys, and I repeated that only Kelly and Diane had spares. She asked about house cleaners or maintenance people, and I said we didn't use any services. She showed me 3 more clips from other nights over the past 2 weeks. The same man entering with a key while Kelly was at work, and I was presumably busy. Each time he stayed between 1 and 3 hours. I felt sick realizing this stranger had been alone with my daughter multiple times. Detective Pierce asked if Kelly was having an affair, and I said no. That was impossible. She asked how I could be sure, and I admitted I couldn't, but Kelly wouldn't do that. She wouldn't bring someone to our house around Emma. Detective Pierce said people surprised you and she'd seen worse. She asked if I wanted to review the footage with Kelly present. I said yes, because Kelly needed to see this and explain what was happening. They brought Kelly back in and showed her the clips. Her face went white, and she said she didn't know who that man was. Detective Pierce asked if she was sure, and Kelly insisted she'd never seen him before. I asked how he got a key, and Kelly said she had no idea. The only person besides us with a key was her mother. We all looked at each other as the implication hit. Detective Pierce asked if Diane could have given the key to someone, and Kelly said she couldn't imagine why. I said maybe we should ask Diane directly. Detective Pierce agreed and sent an officer to bring Diane from the hospital where she was still with Emma. While we waited, Kelly and I sat in that interview room in stunned silence. I asked if she really had no idea who the man was, and she swore she didn't. She asked if I thought he'd hurt Emma, and I said the bruises suggested someone had grabbed her roughly. Kelly started crying again, saying she never should have worked so many shifts. that she'd been so focused on advancing her career, she'd neglected our family. I told her this wasn't her fault, but we needed to figure out who this man was and why Diane might have given him access to our house. Diane arrived 30 minutes later with Diane looking confused and defensive. Detective Pierce showed her the ring footage and asked if she recognized the man. Diane's face went through several expressions before settling on something close to guilt. She admitted she knew who it was. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he was a private investigator she'd hired to watch me. Kelly and I both started yelling at once, asking why she'd done that. Diane said she'd been worried about Emma's safety because I seemed unstable and overwhelmed, that she'd noticed bruises on Emma before and wanted evidence of what I was doing. She'd given Marcus a copy of the house key so he could install hidden cameras throughout the house to record my interactions with Emma. I felt violated and furious that my own mother-in-law had invaded our privacy and put Emma at risk. Detective Pierce asked where these hidden cameras were, and Diane said Marcus had installed them in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. That he'd been monitoring the footage remotely and coming by every few days to check the equipment. Kelly asked if her mother had lost her mind, and Diane started defending herself, saying she'd only been trying to protect her granddaughter. Detective Pierce asked for Marcus Thorne's contact information, and Diane reluctantly provided his phone number and business card. She called him immediately and put it on speaker. Marcus answered, and Detective Pierce identified herself and asked him to come to the station immediately. He asked what this was about, and she said it involved a child abuse investigation and hidden surveillance in a private home. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. While we waited, Detective Pierce explained that Marcus had potentially committed several crimes, including illegal surveillance and trespassing, that Diane could face charges for hiring him and providing access. Diane started backtracking, saying she'd only wanted to help and hadn't known it was illegal. I asked if the hidden cameras had recorded anything showing who actually hurt Emma. Diane said Marcus had reviewed all the footage and told her I'd been rough with Emma several times, that I'd yelled at her and grabbed her arms when she wouldn't listen. I said that was a lie and demanded to see the footage. Marcus arrived and was immediately confrontational. He said he'd been doing his job protecting a child and didn't appreciate being treated like a criminal. Detective Pierce told him to sit down and explain why he'd been entering a private residence without the homeowner's permission. Marcus said he had permission from Diane, who was a key holder and concerned family member. Detective Pierce said that wasn't how the law worked, and he'd be facing charges. She asked him to provide all footage from the hidden cameras immediately. Marcus pulled out a tablet and started loading files. He showed us several clips of me with Emma from various angles. In one, I was trying to get Emma to eat dinner, and she was refusing. I'd raised my voice saying she needed to finish her vegetables. In another, Emma was having a tantrum about bedtime, and I'd picked her up firmly to carry her upstairs. Marcus pointed at this clip saying I'd grabbed her arms too roughly. I watched myself in the video and saw that I had gripped her upper arms to lift her, probably harder than necessary because I was frustrated. But it wasn't abuse. It was a tired parent dealing with a difficult toddler. Detective Pierce asked Marcus if he'd ever had physical contact with Emma, and he said absolutely not. She asked if he could explain the bruises that looked like adult finger marks. He said those must have come from me based on the footage he'd seen. I asked when he'd been in the house most recently, and he said 3 nights ago, the same night as the last Ring doorbell footage. I asked what he'd been doing for 2 hours, and he said checking camera equipment and reviewing footage. Detective Pierce asked if he'd interacted with Emma at all, and he insisted he hadn't. She asked where Emma had been, and he said probably asleep in her room. I said Emma had been awake that night because I'd heard her crying through the baby monitor after my work call ended. I'd gone to check on her and she'd been upset, saying she'd had a bad dream. Marcus shifted uncomfortably and said maybe she'd woken up while he was there. Detective Pierce asked if Emma had seen him, and he admitted it was possible, that he'd been in the hallway when he'd heard crying from her room, that he'd opened her door slightly to check if she was okay. I felt my hands forming fists because this stranger had been in my daughter's room without my knowledge. Detective Pierce asked what happened next, and Marcus said Emma had started crying harder when she saw him, that he'd tried to quiet her down so I wouldn't hear. He'd put his hand over her mouth and she'd struggled, so he'd grabbed her arms to hold her still. He'd told her to be quiet and that he was a friend of her grandma's. After a few minutes, she'd calmed down and he'd left her room. He insisted he hadn't hurt her, just prevented her from alerting me to his presence. Kelly was screaming at him, asking how he could possibly think that was okay. Marcus said he'd panicked and made a poor decision, but his intention was never to harm Emma. Detective Pierce was already calling for another officer to arrest Marcus for assault of a minor and illegal surveillance. I watched them handcuff him while he protested that he'd been hired to protect Emma. Diane was sobbing, saying she'd never meant for any of this to happen, that she'd only wanted to prove I was hurting Emma. Kelly turned on her mother and said she'd destroyed their family with her paranoia and judgment, that her need to be right about me being a bad husband had led to a stranger traumatizing Emma. Diane tried to defend herself, but Kelly told her to leave and never contact them again. Detective Pierce said Diane would be facing charges as well for her role in the illegal surveillance. She asked if we wanted to press additional charges, and both Kelly and I said yes. I wanted everyone involved held accountable for what happened to Emma. They released me from custody and arranged for Kelly and me to pick up Emma from the hospital. We drove there in silence, both processing everything that had happened. Emma was in a pediatric examination room with a child advocate when we arrived. She ran to me crying, and I held her while she sobbed into my shoulder. The advocate said Emma had been telling them more details about the scary man, that he'd come into her room several times and told her not to tell anyone or her daddy would be in trouble. Emma had been terrified, but thought she was protecting me by keeping the secret. The advocate said Emma would need therapy to process the trauma, but she was physically okay besides the bruises. We took Emma home, and I carried her through the house, noticing it differently now, knowing strangers had been watching us. Over the next few days, Kelly took time off work while we had the locks changed and found all of Marcus's hidden cameras. There were 5 total, disguised as smoke detectors and picture frames. Each one felt like another violation of our privacy and safety. Kelly and I barely spoke beyond the logistics of caring for Emma. The trust between us had fractured, not because I'd hurt Emma, but because Kelly had doubted me so easily, because she'd been discussing her concerns with Diane instead of confronting me directly. 2 weeks later, we met with a family therapist named Dr. Amara Singh, who specialized in trauma and rebuilding trust. She had us sit in her office while Emma played with toys in the waiting room with a child specialist. Dr. Singh asked us to each explain what had happened from our perspectives. I described the terror of being accused of hurting my daughter and the betrayal of discovering my wife had been listening to her mother's doubts about me. Kelly explained the guilt of working too much and the confusion of not knowing what to believe when the evidence seemed to point at me. Dr. Singh said both of our feelings were valid, but we needed to work through them together, or the trauma would destroy our marriage. She asked why Kelly had been so quick to doubt me, and Kelly admitted she'd been influenced by her mother's constant criticism, that Diane had been planting seeds of doubt about my parenting for months, and Kelly had started unconsciously looking for problems. I asked why Kelly hadn't talked to me about it, and she said she'd been afraid of confrontation, that her mother had taught her to avoid conflict and observe rather than engage. Dr. Singh said that pattern needed to change if we wanted to survive this. Over the following weeks, we met with Dr. Singh twice weekly, while Emma saw a child trauma specialist named Rebecca Foster. Rebecca used play therapy to help Emma process what had happened with the scary man in her room. Emma drew pictures of Marcus and told Rebecca how scared she'd been when he'd covered her mouth. Rebecca taught Emma that adults who ask you to keep secrets from your parents are not safe people, that she should always tell her mommy and daddy if something scares her. The bruises on Emma's arms faded, but the psychological impact took longer. She had nightmares and separation anxiety, clinging to me whenever I tried to leave a room. Kelly watched this with visible guilt, knowing her long work hours had contributed to leaving Emma vulnerable. She reduced her shifts at the hospital and started working from home more often, turning down a promotion she'd been pursuing for months. Marcus Thorne was charged with assault of a minor, illegal surveillance, and trespassing. His private investigation license was revoked, and he faced up to 5 years in prison. His lawyer tried to argue he'd been hired by a concerned family member and had made a mistake in judgment. The prosecutor countered that he'd assaulted a child to hide his own illegal activity and shown no remorse. Diane was charged as an accomplice to illegal surveillance and faced up to 2 years. Her lawyer argued she'd been acting out of genuine concern for her granddaughter's welfare. The prosecutor said her actions had directly led to the trauma of that granddaughter, and she needed to face consequences. Kelly and I had to decide whether to testify at their trials or accept plea deals. The prosecutor recommended we testify to ensure serious sentences, but Dr. Singh worried about the impact of reliving everything publicly. We ultimately agreed to victim impact statements that would be read in court without us being present. Kelly wrote 3 pages about her guilt and anger at her mother for manipulating her and putting Emma at risk. I wrote about the violation of having my home invaded and my daughter terrorized while I was feet away working, about the ongoing trauma Emma was experiencing and the cost of therapy and security measures we'd had to take. The judge sentenced Marcus to 3 years in prison followed by probation. Diane received 18 months with work release, meaning she'd served time in jail but could leave for employment. She was also ordered to have no contact with Emma for 5 years and could only contact Kelly under supervised conditions. Kelly didn't attend her mother's sentencing, saying she wasn't ready to see Diane. I went with Kelly's father, Richard, who was devastated by his wife's actions and had filed for separation. Richard apologized repeatedly for not seeing what Diane was doing and for not stopping her obsession with proving I was a bad father. He said Diane had always been controlling, but he'd never imagined it would go this far. Months passed, and our family slowly found a new rhythm. Emma's nightmares decreased, and she started sleeping through the night again. Kelly and I worked through our trust issues in therapy, learning to communicate directly instead of letting resentment build. We celebrated Emma's 4th birthday at a small party with just Kelly's father and a few of Emma's preschool friends. No Diane, no drama, just simple joy watching Emma blow out candles on her cake. I quit freelancing and took a full-time position at a design agency that offered better benefits and stability. Kelly reduced her hours to part-time and started a research project that allowed her to work from home 3 days a week. We were both home for dinner most nights and took turns doing bedtime with Emma. The financial adjustment was hard, but worth it for the peace in our home. Kelly's relationship with her mother remained severed. Diane sent letters from jail that Kelly threw away unopened. Richard visited occasionally and updated us that Diane was attending counseling in jail, but still maintained she'd only been trying to protect Emma. He said Diane wanted to apologize, but Kelly said she wasn't interested. Some violations couldn't be forgiven. Marcus was released after 18 months for good behavior and moved to a different state. His career as a private investigator was over, and last Richard heard he was working construction. I hoped he understood the damage he'd caused by prioritizing his job over a child's well-being. I hoped he couldn't sleep at night thinking about holding a terrified 3-year-old down and telling her to keep secrets. Emma started kindergarten and brought home artwork showing our family, always the 3 of us, no grandma. Her teacher commented that Emma was bright and social, but sometimes got anxious when I dropped her off, watching until I was completely out of sight. I explained our family had been through trauma and Emma needed extra reassurance about safety. The school put accommodations in place, allowing me to text the teacher after drop-off so Emma could see a message that Daddy was thinking about her. 2 years after the incident, Dr. Singh suggested we might be ready to reduce therapy to monthly sessions. She said we'd done remarkable work rebuilding trust and establishing healthy communication patterns. Kelly and I celebrated that night after Emma went to bed, opening a bottle of wine and talking about everything we'd survived. Kelly said she'd been thinking about Diane lately and wondering if maybe someday there could be limited contact again. I asked if she was sure, and she said she wasn't, but Emma asked about Grandma sometimes and Kelly felt conflicted. I told Kelly whatever she decided, I'd support it, but Diane would never be alone with Emma again. That was non-negotiable. Kelly agreed and said if contact happened, it would be supervised visits in public places with both of us present. But not yet. Not until she was certain Diane had actually changed. Richard reported that Diane had been released from jail and was living in a small apartment downtown. She'd been attending therapy weekly and had started medication for anxiety and obsessive thoughts. She'd asked Richard to pass along that she understood why Kelly had cut her off and didn't expect forgiveness. That she'd destroyed the most important relationships in her life and had to live with that. Richard said Diane cried every time she saw children Emma's age and realized what she'd lost. Emma turned 6 and started asking more direct questions about why Grandma wasn't around. Kelly and I had prepared for this with Dr. Singh's help. We explained in age-appropriate terms that Grandma had made some very bad choices that hurt our family. That she'd hired someone who'd scared Emma and that wasn't safe. We said maybe someday Grandma would be able to visit again, but right now she needed to work on being better. Emma accepted this explanation and went back to playing. Her nightmares had stopped and the separation anxiety had faded. She was thriving in school and had close friends and felt safe in our home. That was all that mattered. 3 years after the incident, Kelly received a card from Diane on Mother's Day. Inside was a simple message saying she was proud of the mother Kelly had become and was sorry for all the pain she'd caused. That she understood she might never be part of Emma's life again, but hoped Kelly had found peace. Kelly cried reading it and asked what I thought. I said it was her mother and her decision. That I couldn't tell her whether to rebuild that relationship or keep her distance. Kelly put the card away and didn't respond. 6 months later, Kelly agreed to meet Diane for coffee with Richard, present as a buffer. She came home shaken, saying Diane looked older and broken in ways she'd never seen. That Diane had apologized extensively and shown Kelly folders full of therapy worksheets and medication records. That Diane was seeing a psychiatrist who'd diagnosed her with obsessive-compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, both of which had gone untreated for decades. The obsessive thoughts about Emma being in danger had consumed Diane until she'd convinced herself intervention was necessary. Kelly said Diane took full responsibility and didn't make excuses, which was progress. But Kelly wasn't ready to forgive yet. She met with Diane twice more over the following months, always in public places with Richard present. Gradually, Kelly started to believe her mother had genuinely changed. 4 years after the incident, Kelly suggested a supervised visit between Diane and Emma at a family therapy session with Dr. Singh present. I was hesitant, but agreed if everyone involved thought it was safe. We scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon at Dr. Singh's office. Diane arrived early, visibly nervous. Emma didn't remember her grandmother and was confused about why we were there. Dr. Singh explained that this was Grandma Diane who'd been away for a while but wanted to meet Emma. Emma was shy at first, hiding behind Kelly. Diane didn't push, just sat across the room and told Emma she'd brought a stuffed animal as a gift. Emma eventually crossed the room to examine the gift, a soft rabbit that Diane said had been Kelly's when she was Emma's age. Emma warmed up slowly, and by the end of the hour was showing Diane her school papers from her backpack. Dr. Singh said the visit went well, and they could try again in a few weeks. Over the next year, Diane had supervised visits with Emma once a month, always at Dr. Singh's office or public places like parks and museums. She never asked to be alone with Emma, and never pushed boundaries. She sent birthday and holiday cards but didn't call the house. She attended Emma's school concert sitting in the back row with Richard, and didn't approach us afterward. 5 years after the incident, Kelly asked if I'd be comfortable with Diane coming to Emma's 7th birthday party at our house. It would be her first time in our home since the arrest. I said yes because Kelly had been working toward this for years, and I trusted her judgment. Diane arrived with Richard and brought a carefully chosen gift, an art set Emma had mentioned wanting. She stayed for 2 hours, interacting with Emma, but also giving her space. She complimented our home and didn't criticize anything. She thanked us for allowing her to be there. After she left, Kelly asked how I felt, and I said it had been okay. That Diane seemed different, humbler, and less judgmental. But I'd been watching Emma carefully, and Emma had seemed comfortable, which was the most important thing. Dr. Singh said we'd reached a healthy place where limited contact was possible without risking Emma's well-being. That the years of therapy and accountability had allowed for healing most families never achieved. Kelly said she'd forgiven her mother, but would never forget what happened. That the relationship would always have boundaries and limits. Diane seemed to understand and accept that. Emma asked one day if Grandma Diane could come to her school play, and Kelly said yes. Diane sat with us in the audience watching Emma play a flower in the spring pageant. She didn't take photos without permission or make a scene. She told Emma afterward that she was wonderful, and then said goodbye without asking for more time. Kelly told me later she'd seen tears in Diane's eyes knowing what she'd lost and could never fully regain. Marcus sent a letter addressed to Kelly and me that arrived 6 years after the incident. He was living in Idaho, working construction and attending court-ordered therapy. He wrote that he thought about Emma daily and lived with profound guilt over what he'd done. That he'd been so focused on completing his job for Diane that he'd lost sight of basic human decency. That covering a child's mouth and grabbing her to prevent her from calling for help was unconscionable, regardless of his reasoning. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness because he didn't deserve it. He just wanted us to know he'd changed and would spend the rest of his life trying to be better. Kelly and I read the letter together, and I asked if she believed him. She said it didn't matter if we believed him or not. What mattered was Emma was safe and thriving. We threw the letter away and didn't respond. Emma turned 8 and asked if she could spend the weekend at Grandma Diane's apartment. Kelly and I looked at each other, and I saw the conflict in her eyes. Dr. Singh said if we felt ready, supervised overnight visits could be the next step. But neither Kelly nor I felt ready for that. We told Emma maybe someday, but not yet. Emma accepted this and went back to her homework. Diane didn't push when Kelly told her about Emma's request. She said she understood and was grateful for the time she got. That she knew she'd never have the relationship with Emma she could have had if she hadn't destroyed everything. Kelly said her mother sounded genuinely remorseful, which was different from the defensive, justifying person she'd been before. Richard said Diane's therapy had helped her understand how her anxiety and need for control had manifested as obsessive beliefs about threats to Emma. That she'd convinced herself I was dangerous because she couldn't accept Kelly marrying someone she hadn't chosen. That losing Kelly and Emma had forced her to confront her own issues finally. I asked Richard if he'd ever go back to Diane, and he said no, that some things couldn't be repaired. But he was glad she was getting help and could have limited contact with Emma. 9 years after the incident, Emma was in 4th grade and thriving. She played soccer and took art classes and had a group of close friends. She occasionally mentioned the scary man from when she was little, but seemed to have processed it as something bad that happened, but didn't define her. Kelly and I had been in couples therapy for nearly a decade, and our marriage was stronger than it had been before the crisis. We'd learned to communicate honestly and confront problems instead of letting them fester. We'd learned I couldn't parent alone while Kelly pursued her career without cost, that we needed to be partners, sharing the load equally. Diane attended Emma's soccer games sometimes, cheering from a distance. She'd never asked for unsupervised time and seemed content with the boundaries we'd established. Kelly met her for coffee monthly and said their conversations were superficial but pleasant. They'd never have the close relationship they'd had before, but they had something. Looking back, I realized Diane calling the police had been the catalyst for everything that followed. If she'd never made that call, we'd never have discovered Marcus breaking into our house. Emma's trauma would have continued and escalated. I might never have known my mother-in-law was investigating me. The ring footage would have sat unwatched, and the hidden cameras would have recorded us indefinitely. The call forced everything into the light, led to Marcus's arrest, and Emma getting help she desperately needed. It destroyed Diane's relationship with her family, but also forced her to confront her mental health issues. It nearly destroyed my marriage, but ultimately made it stronger. So when people asked how I felt about my mother-in-law calling the police and accusing me of child abuse, I told them the truth. I was grateful she did it. Not because her suspicions were correct, but because her paranoid overreach had accidentally exposed the real threat. Because sometimes the wrong action for the wrong reasons led to the right outcome. Because Emma was safe and thriving, and Diane was getting help, and our family had survived something that could have destroyed us. 10 years after that terrible day when police pulled into my driveway, Emma turned 13 and asked to write about what happened for a school project on overcoming adversity. Kelly and I discussed it with Dr. Singh and decided Emma was old enough to own her story. She wrote about a scary man coming into her room when she was little and how her parents and therapists helped her feel safe again. She wrote about forgiveness and boundaries and how families could heal from terrible things. Her teacher called it the most mature and insightful piece she'd seen from a middle schooler. That night, Emma asked if she could show Grandma Diane the essay, and Kelly said yes. Diane read it with tears streaming down her face and told Emma she was proud of her strength. Then Diane left without asking for anything more because she finally understood that Emma's well-being had to come before her own needs and learning that lesson had cost her everything, but maybe, possibly, saved us all. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.